Okay, welcome back again. Jim Broomall here from Shepherd University, and I'm extraordinarily pleased to welcome Dr. Joe Rizzo, Executive Director of the Loudon Museum. I've known Joe now for a number of years. We've been very happy in recent time to partner on a couple different programs, and we're extremely pleased to have him here today to talk about the role of the 8th Virginia. To just quickly orient you, and Joe's going to do most of the talking here, but just to quickly orient you, off in the distance, Pat, if you can, we can see the Gettysburg Turnpike, and then off in the far distance, if you can catch that, Pat, we can see the roof line of the Kadori Barn. And then we're to the front of the Seminary Ridge. And so again, just to kind of give us some orientation as to where we are geographically on the battlefield. And with that, I'll turn it over to Joe.
Great, yeah, thanks so much, Jim. I'm thrilled to be doing this with you all. For years come to Pickett's Charge, and I'm happy to be able to talk about it now with a whole new audience. And one thing I've noticed is that Pickett's Charge is long remembered for its failure and its carnage. And I think because of that, though, it sometimes leads to some misconceptions that what this is simply just at the end of the battle, a frontal assault that comes to clear failure. But it's much more complicated of an attack than just simply a frontal attack. There's a lot of maneuvers that they have to do once this begins.
Sure.
But I want to tell this story particularly through one regiment, though, and that's the 8th Virginia Infantry. It's a primarily Loudoun County raised unit, some Prince William County and some Fauquier counties, but Northern Virginia raised. And they're raised the spring of 1861, just after the secession crisis, and Eppa Hunton, kind of a politician slash turned colonel, is the one who brings them together and trains them in Leesburg, Virginia.
And they're engaged not too far from where you are, right? Is that correct? Very
Absolutely,
early on in the
yeah.
war.
So they get jumped in pretty quick, not just with 1st Manassas when they fight on Henry Hill, but then just a few months after that, they're primarily the ones involved with Ball's Bluff,
Right, of course.
just about a mile and a half from Leesburg. And there you see Eppa Hunton, but then also they're known as the Brothers Regiment, and sometimes the Berkeley Regiment. That's because they are very much a regiment of brothers, and most notably the Berkeley brothers. They're 4 brothers who help with recruiting, training, and they're all officers in the 8th Virginia, and they're all here at Pickett's Charge, and they're all going to suffer in one way or the other.
Okay, and that gives, I guess, voice to one of the things we've been talking about over the past 2 days, which is the kind of kinship networks and friendship networks that entwine these regiments together and build, in some cases, almost bonds of brotherhood or literal brotherhood in these cases.
Yeah, it's literal and figurative with the 8th Virginia. Again, there's 80-plus sets of brothers who fight within the regiment during the war. Yeah. There's several sets of 4. The Berkeley is just the most well-known. But they're tested here like no other spot, and you see a lot of ends of those close relationships and brotherhoods that they form. Okay. And for this regiment, even though they're at Ball's Bluff like we talked about, they're heavily involved in the Peninsula Campaign. They're really a lead unit in Gaines Mill during the 7 Days Campaign, and they're with James Longstreet on Chin Ridge at 2nd Manassas. So they're no strangers to large attacks and being heavily involved in fighting. Okay. But for the end of 1862 and early parts of 1863, they're not involved really at Fredericksburg, and they're not even at Chancellorsville. So they're very much ready to get back into the fight and reconnect with the Army of Northern Virginia. And when Lee starts taking his army back up north and going through Loudoun again, but then through Maryland and Pennsylvania, they're very much excited to be a part of that. And you see that in their letters, where they're writing constantly about this might be the last campaign. They want to make sure that they're involved in it, and they really think whatever they're going to, which is unknown, could be the end of the war. And they're very much excited the fact that they're not missing the war or the battle here when they're not here on July 1 or July 2.
Yeah, and I guess this also kind of connects to the theme that we talked about yesterday with Dr. Black, and that is that there are across this battlefield different regiments with different kind of ideologies propelling them forward. We have some who are at the forefront of the secessionist movement. We had others that Daryl talked about from Western North Carolina that were not as strong on that front. And here's a group enlist early, are a veteran regiment, and are enthusiastic about the prospects of this northern invasion, it seems like.
Yeah, absolutely. William Berkeley, one of those 4 brothers, an officer in the regiment, he writes about the excitement, thinking that this is going to be whatever the last campaign looks like, will be, though, the last one. Okay. So they want to be a part of it. And they're up in Chambersburg for day 1, and then they come closer around Marsh Creek on day 2. And Robert E. Lee's somewhat optimistic about the successes they had on day 1 and 2, and he's hoping that day 3 can be a continuation of that. I think sometimes people think that this is completely detached from day 2. But Lee kind of envisioned this continuing on, even in the same location in a lot of ways, continuing on from the end of day 2. Pickett's his last fresh division, though, and he's bringing them up. He wrongly thinks they'll be in place for an early morning attack in coordination with Ewell, but that's not quite the case. It'll take Pickett longer to get his division up than planned. He gets them on the road coming up here through the fighting on day one, but they don't get into place behind where the camera is now within the Spangler Woods until about 8, 9 o'clock. And they arrive in order with which they're marching up. So James Kemper's brigade comes in first. They get placed behind the Spangler house, now where you're going through now, which is the orchard, and then the Spangler Woods behind it. Kemper's brigade comes in first, and then the 8th Virginia is the regiment leading Garnett's brigade into place, and then Armistead's following suit. And there's about a 400-yard gap between them and Pettigrew's division while they're waiting in the morning of July 3rd.
Okay. So a lot of anticipation, I imagine, on the morning of July the 3rd as these men are kind of figuring out what's going to unfold that day. Are they under some artillery bombardment, I imagine, or at least some enemy fire?
Yeah, so for a while they're not, and that's what I always wonder about, the psyche of a soldier waiting for the unknown. They don't know what's coming, they're not sure what to expect. And for Robert E. Lee's plans, he hopes this begins earlier in the day, but the artillery bombardment doesn't start until 1 p.m.
Okay.
So that's hours of laying low, trying to get cover from the sun, not knowing what you're going to be doing next. However, then when it begins around 1:07 p.m., that starts a whole nother kind of psychological concern for the soldiers of the 8th Virginia, as they're getting artillery fire from not just straight in front of them like people normally think, but they're getting it from the left around Cemetery Ridge, then closer to Little Round Top and even Little Round Top. And for this next about 25 minutes, then pushing to an hour, the torment had to be incredible for the men of the 8th Virginia, because there's really no shelter that you can find.
Right.
Branches are falling everywhere, limbs are falling everywhere. They're already surrounded by the acrid smell of battle after 2 days, and there's really nowhere they can go. And they're seeing that firsthand. And the key part of the artillery bombardment, I think, that afternoon isn't the death toll, it's the psychological toll.
No, I think that's really
and you see that all throughout the writings of the 8th Virginia. Ben Jackson and Albert Morris are two guys who met each other when they signed up in the spring of 1861. They're killed by the same shot that comes through the lines for the 8th Virginia. Edmund Berkeley writes about how Albert Morris's brains were splattered on his hat and got on the faces of the men of the 8th. So, I mean, that's a sight you can't not see.
Right. Yeah.
You'll always going to remember that, and that's what I think is so noticeable about how they write about this. And you're familiar with Albert Shotwell.
I am, yeah.
Shotwell mentions how when he's in the tree line, he sees a shot, hears a shot go right over his head. He turns around, then writes after the fact that he saw it cut 2 men in half.
Oh my gosh.
So those are things that are horrific for the men experiencing them, and these aren't video games; they don't disappear.
Right.
They're then still surrounding them on the hot, July day. But there are some moments of kind of levity and just odd moments too by some of the soldiers. There's a guy named Dick Maddox, who's a private, who wants to go fill up some of the canteens for the men of the 8th. And it had to have been the Spangler house where he took them, this area here, looking for a well, but it was all dry. Then he went into the house, looked around. It was, of course, abandoned by this point. Found a straw hat and took off his Confederate cap, replaced it with a straw hat, went back into line. So, unknowing, what his future lay, at least he had a different hat for it.
Right. Better shade, I imagine.
Yeah, and then Edmund Berkeley, again, one of the Berkeley brothers, an officer in the regiment, he had a deck of cards with him while he was waiting. And again, the last thing in my mind would be a deck of cards and what my corpse would look like with those on it. But in Victoria's standards, he doesn't want that to be found on his body if he is deceased. And he writes after the fact that he played countless hours by fires with Richard Garnett and Epahunton, but he puts those under some rocks, so he's not found with them on there.
Okay, that's amazing. Again, that connectivity between the home front and the battlefield that we sometimes erase, but is always right at the forefront of soldiers' minds.
Yeah, and more in the Civil War more than other future wars too. These are men who sometimes grew up together, or at least from a lot of the similar hometowns, and sometimes have family ties as well. So they're the ones that will be going in this together. And strategically, the 8th Virginia and really Garnett's brigade, they're not crippled by the artillery bombardment for that hour, roughly from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. It's really the psychological strain that's more than anything, between that and the heat and not exactly knowing what's to come.
Okay, perfect. So I believe we're going to take a bit of a break. We're going to walk towards the area of the Kadori farm. And
we'll follow their movements through, and we'll see how it ends up for them.
Okay. Thank you all so much. We're going to come back to you live in probably about 10-15 minutes time.